The year was 1884. Dust clung to the air as the stagecoach rattled down the winding trail, cutting through the vast plains of the American West. Inside, Clara May held her satchel tightly against her chest, her gloved hands trembling slightly despite the heat. Her heart beat fast, not from fear of the journey, but from the uncertain life that lay ahead. Clara had never imagined her life would come to this, boarding a coach headed toward a stranger's arms, pretending to be someone entirely new. But after years working as a saloon girl in St. Louis, she'd learned the hard way that men didn't fall in love with women like her. They bought her time, stole her smiles, whispered promises. But love? That was for church-going girls with good family names and quiet reputations. When Clara's mother passed and the saloon owner changed hands to someone cruel and careless, Clara saw her chance to escape. She had scraped together enough wages and tips to buy passage west and sent out letters to a handful of ranchers advertising for wives. She didn't lie, not entirely, but she didn't offer her full truth either. One man replied, James Harland, a cattle rancher near the small frontier town of Dust River. His letter had been short but kind. He wanted a woman who could work the land beside him, who would raise a family and build a home. He didn't ask for a virtuous virgin or a wealthy dowry. He wanted a partner. That was something Clara could be done as the stagecoach rolled into the town square. Clara adjusted her bonnet, tucking a loose strand of her chestnut hair behind her ear. The town was small wooden buildings weathered by the prairie wind, with a church steeple rising in the distance and a general store facing the saloon across the street. Her breath caught at the sight of the saloon doors swinging open. A group of cowboys leaned lazily against the railings, and for a moment, Clara felt a wave of old shame creep up her spine. But this wasn't St. Louis, and she wasn't that girl. Any more. She stepped down from the coach, her boots kicking up dust. A tall man with sunburnt skin, a wide-brimmed hat, and calloused hands approached her. He had a strong jaw, sharp eyes, and a leather vest worn from years of work. "Clara May?" he asked, his voice gruff but uncertain. She nodded. "Mr. Harland. It's a pleasure to meet you." They shook hands, and for a moment there was a flicker of something soft in his expression. But it didn't last. Within minutes, murmurs began circling around them like vultures. Two women outside the general store paused mid-step, whispering to each other as they stared. A ranch hand across the street narrowed his eyes, then nudged a companion. Clara caught the look. Recognition. Then came the cruelest sound: laughter. Low and ugly. A man called out from the saloon, "Ain't that Clara May from the Red Velvet Room? Didn't know she did house calls now." James Harland stiffened beside her. His smile disappeared. Clara froze. Her fingers clutched the strap of her satchel, digging in hard. This couldn't be happening, not this fast. Not again. James turned toward her, his face clouded with confusion, then anger. "You didn't tell me. You were that kind of girl." "I'm not anymore," Clara said softly. "I left that behind." But it was too late. His eyes no longer looked at her with curiosity or warmth. They were cold now, guarded. The distance between them had grown wider than the entire prairie. "Can't marry a woman with a reputation like yours," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm sorry. I thought I was getting someone decent." His words hit her like a slap. He turned and walked away, leaving Clara standing alone on the dirt road, her hopes scattering like dust in the wind. The stagecoach rattled off behind her. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Just the stares of strangers, the echoes of old rumors, and the painful knowledge that her past still had power over her future. But Clara May was no stranger to starting over. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and whispered to herself, "You came here for a future. You'll find one with or without him." And with that, she took her first steps into a town that wasn't ready to accept her, but a town she would one day make remember her name for all the right reasons. The wind carried dust through the town of Dust River like a whisper of judgment, scratching at Clara May's already fraying nerves. The sun beat down from a cloudless sky, but her skin felt colder than it had in the drafty saloon back in St. Louis. James Harlan's rejection echoed in her ears, louder than the murmur of townspeople or the slam of saloon doors across the T. Street she stood alone, her satchel still clutched tightly in her hand, heart pounding with humiliation. Her first meeting with James, her intended, had lasted barely 10 minutes, and already she had been judged, tried, and cast aside. The townsfolk didn't need time to get to know her. One glance, one whispered rumor, and they'd made up their minds. The saloon doors creaked again behind her. Another laugh drifted out, and Clara bit the inside of her cheek to keep from breaking. She would not cry. Not here. Not in front of these people. She started walking down the dusty street, her steps unsure. With no groom, no home, and no one waiting for her, she wasn't just a stranger anymore, she was a scandal. She passed the church where a preacher gave her a sideways glance, and the schoolhouse where 2 young girls stopped skipping rope to stare at her. She'd seen this before. Once people labeled you, they never stopped. Clara stopped outside the general store. She considered going inside, asking about boarding rooms, but before she could take a step forward, the owner's wife appeared in the doorway and closed the door, firmly in her face. She wasn't welcome. She walked for another half-hour before. Exhaustion and despair finally made her sit down on a bench outside the livery stable. Her legs ached, her boots pinched, and her stomach rumbled, empty since morning. She pulled her shawl tighter around her and leaned her head back against the wall, eyes closed. She had survived worse, she told herself. But survival wasn't the same as living. Just then, a soft voice broke the silence. "You new in town, dear?" Clara opened her eyes to see an older woman with a kind smile and eyes like worn denim. She wore a simple cotton dress and a bonnet, her gray hair tied neatly at the back of her neck. Clara nodded. "I was supposed to marry James Harlan." The woman sighed, sitting down beside her. "I heard. Town talks fast. Doesn't always think before it does." "I guess I should leave," Clara whispered, barely able to keep her voice steady. "Why?" "Because a man changed his mind and the town's full of fools?" The woman gave a snort. "Don't be silly. You're not the first woman to come here, hoping for a second chance, and you won't be the last." "I used to work in a saloon," Clara said. "Back east. I wasn't. Well, I wasn't the kind of girl men marry." The woman gave her a long look but didn't flinch. "My name's Mrs. Whitlow. I run the bakery down the street. You can stay in my guest room for a while if you don't mind helping knead dough in the mornings." Clara blinked. "You'd really do that?" "Even knowing I don't care where you've been. I care about who you are now. Besides, the good Lord didn't say he only helps perfect people." A knot in Clara's throat threatened to choke her. She nodded, wiping her eyes quickly. By evening, Clara had a place to sleep and a warm bowl of stew in her hands. But inside, she still wrestled with the sting of rejection. James Harlan's words kept repeating in her head like a brand. "I thought I was getting someone decent." She wasn't angry at him, not entirely. He had been kind in his letters, maybe even hopeful. But the moment her past touched his pride, he turned cold. Like so many others, what hurt the most wasn't that he said no. It was that he never even gave her a chance to show who she was now. That night, lying on a simple cot in Mrs. Whitlow's spare room, Clara stared at the cracked ceiling and promised herself something. If this town didn't want her, fine, but she would make a life here anyway, not by begging for acceptance, but by earning respect. Not with words, but with work. She wouldn't hide her past, but she also wouldn't let it define her. And somewhere, beneath all the shame and pain, Small flicker of hope still burned. It wasn't the welcome she'd dreamed of, but maybe it was the beginning she needed. Clara May woke before the sun rose the next morning. The scent of fresh bread and yeast filled the air, wafting up from the bakery below like a soft reminder that she wasn't entirely alone in the world. She sat up on the small cot in Mrs. Whitlow's spare room, still half expecting it all to be a dream, that she'd wake up in her old rented room above the Saloon in St. Louis, that her escape west was only a fantasy. But the worn wooden walls and the creak of the floorboards told her otherwise. Reality had set in fast. She was stranded in a town that had already made up its mind about her, with no job, no family, and no man to vouch for her. In a place like Dust River, being unmarried and new was already enough to draw attention. Being a woman with a past? That made her a walking target for gossip and judgment. Downstairs, Mrs. Whitlow handed her a freshly tied apron and a warm smile. "You need." "I shape. That's our rhythm," the older woman said cheerfully. Clara nodded gratefully and got to work. Her hands moved methodically through the dough, pressing and folding, pressing and folding. For once, the silence wasn't suffocating, it was soothing. Every movement was a step away from her old life, from the sultry songs of the saloon and the clinking of shot glasses. In this kitchen, she was useful. Needed. By mid-morning, customers began lining up outside for their daily bread. Clara kept to the back of the kitchen, but she heard their whispers through the open window. "Isn't that the Harlan girl? The one from back east?" "Not anymore. Word is she used to dance in a saloon. Shameless. And now she's working." For old Whitlow, bless her heart, Clara didn't flinch. Not this time. She pressed harder into the dough, letting their words sink like stones into the pit of her stomach. She had heard worse before, but it didn't mean it hurt any less. Later. That week, she tried asking around town for work. The general store didn't need help. The tailor looked her up and down and muttered something about protecting the reputation of the shop. Even the boarding house turned her away, saying they were at capacity, even though Clara had seen empty rooms with her own eyes. It didn't take long for the town's men to get bolder. One afternoon, as Clara was leaving the well with a bucket of water, a man tipped his hat and smiled. "Heard you were looking for work. I got a place you could earn a little extra. After hours." Clara's eyes narrowed. "I'm not that girl anymore." His smile faded. "Once a saloon girl, always one. Don't go pretending you're better now." He spat near her feet and walked off. Clara stood frozen, her grip on the bucket tightening until her knuckles went white. Each day brought a new reminder that her past clung to her like dust impossible to brush off completely. But she refused to let their words define her. She worked at the bakery from sunup to sundown, saving every coin Mrs. Whitlow paid her, no matter how small. She helped sweep the church steps when no one else would. She bandaged a neighbor boy's scraped knee when he fell off his pony. Slowly, quietly, she was trying to prove that she was more than what people said. Mrs. Whitlow remained her only ally. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire with tea, and the older woman would tell stories of her own youth, of losing her husband too young, of surviving the great drought, of raising a son who never returned from the gold fields. "You know," she said one night, "people talk because it's easy. It takes no courage to judge. But to change, that takes real grit. And you, Clara May, have more grit than this whole town put together." Clara offered a tired smile. She didn't feel strong, but she was still standing, and that had to count for something. And yet, even as she tried to rebuild, the loneliness sank deep. There were nights when she stared at the stars through the attic window, wondering if she'd made a mistake coming here. If she'd ever truly belong anywhere. She had escaped the saloon, yes. But she hadn't escaped the shadow of it. What she didn't know yet was that someone else in town had been watching her, not with judgment, but with quiet curiosity. A man whose own past had made him silent and cautious. A man who knew better than most that the ones who had been hurt the deepest often held the strongest hearts. The first time Clara May saw him, he didn't say a word. It was early morning, the sun barely above the horizon, when she delivered a basket of fresh bread to the livery stable. Mrs. Whitlow had taken a standing order from the McAllister ranch, a dozen loaves every Friday, delivered just past dawn. Clara carried the basket in both hands, trying not to think about the glances she would attract on the street. Dust River wasn't a place that let people forget who they used to be. She stepped inside the stable and caught the scent of hay, leather, and horse. And there he was, Thomas McAllister. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face half hidden beneath the brim of his hat. He stood beside a black stallion, running a brush gently down its back. His hands were strong but careful, his movements calm and steady. He looked up when she entered, his eyes locking with hers. Not suspiciously, not curiously, just quiet. Clara cleared her throat. Bread delivery from Mrs. Whitlow's. He nodded once and walked over. He didn't ask who she was or what she'd done. He just accepted the basket and said, "Thanks." That was all. No judgment. No leering smile. No questions. Just thanks. Clara blinked, startled. "You're welcome." And then she left, her heart strangely lighter. Over the next few weeks, she made that same delivery every Friday. Sometimes she'd catch a glimpse of him working the horses or speaking with his ranch hands. He never said much, but when he did speak, it was direct, simple, and sincere. Word in town said Thomas McAllister was one of the wealthiest landowners for miles. He owned hundreds of acres outside of Dust River, a sprawling ranch with prize cattle and quarter horses. But unlike other men of wealth, he didn't throw his name around. He rarely came into town unless it was for supplies or business at the bank. Some said he was cold. Others said he was broken. The truth was, Thomas kept to himself. His wife had died 5 years ago. Some claimed it was childbirth. Others whispered darker rumors that she had taken her own life. No one knew for sure because Thomas never spoke of it. Since then, he'd lived alone on the ranch with only a few trusted ranch hands for company. He didn't attend church socials, didn't dance at town gatherings, didn't show up at the saloon. He was, in every sense of the word, a mystery. But Clara saw something in him others didn't. She noticed how gently he treated the horses, speaking to them in hushed tones as if they understood. She saw the way he tipped his hat to the stable boys and offered extra coin to the blacksmith when his tools broke. He wasn't a loud man, but he was fair and kind in a quiet way that didn't need to prove itself. One Friday morning, as Clara handed over the basket of bread, Thomas surprised her by speaking first. "You been in town long?" he asked. Clara hesitated. "A few months." He nodded, glancing at her hands roughened from kneading dough, reddened from washing with cold water. "You work hard," he said. She blinked. No one had said that to her in years. People saw her past, not her effort. "I try." He paused, then said, "That bakery's lucky to have you." Clara felt her breath hitch. It was the first real kindness she'd heard from a man in Dust River since James Harlan turned his back on her. "Thank you," she replied softly. From that day on, Thomas began to speak more each time she visited. Small things at first, weather, horses, bread recipes. But beneath the small talk, Clara felt something stir, an unspoken understanding between two people who had been quietly cast aside by the world. Both of them carried pain, wore it like a second skin, and neither asked the other to explain. One afternoon, as she walked past the ranch's corral, she saw Thomas struggling to calm a young mare. The animal bucked and snorted, eyes wild with panic. Clara moved instinctively, murmuring soft words as she stepped inside the fence. Within moments, The Mara began to settle. Thomas watched, surprised. "You've got a gift," he said. Clara shrugged. "I used to handle the drunkards at the saloon. Horses are easier." He let out a short laugh, brief but real. That was the moment something changed. Not instantly, not dramatically, but like a small crack in a long frozen river. From that point on, Thomas began to see Clara not as the woman the town gossiped about, but as the woman she was becoming. Strong, patient, and quietly brave. And, though neither of them knew it yet, their guarded hearts had just taken their first steps side by side towards something neither dared hope for: healing. The seasons began to change in Dust River. Summer's golden haze gave way to the rich auburn hues of autumn. The town was preparing for harvest festivals and cattle drives. Clara May, however, wasn't preparing for much of anything, because she wasn't part of anything. Not really. She still lived quietly in Mrs. Whitlow's guest room and worked long hours at the bakery, her hands always in motion, her heart always guarded. But there was one part of her week she looked forward to: the Friday morning bread deliveries. To McAllister Ranch. Thomas McAllister had slowly become the one man in Dust River who didn't treat her like a cautionary tale. He didn't care about what the town whispered behind her back. In fact, he never mentioned the town at all. When they spoke, it was about practical things: horses, bread, weather. But beneath the simplicity of their words was a growing sense of comfort, a kind of companionship. Clara had learned to read people in silence, and what she saw in Thomas was something she understood deeply: loneliness. He didn't talk about his late wife, and Clara didn't press. She didn't ask about the years he spent alone on the ranch. But in his stillness, in the way he stood beside her without needing to speak, Clara saw the kind of man who had loved deeply and lost. One crisp October morning, as she handed over the bread basket, Thomas said something unexpected. "You busy this afternoon?" Clara blinked. "I don't think so." "Why?" "I want to show you something." She hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "All right." That afternoon, he met her by the stables and led her to a small fenced pasture a few miles from the main house. The air smelled of dry grass and sunlight. In the middle of the field stood a half-built house, simple, with unfinished walls and a roof waiting for shingles. Clara tilted her head. "What's this?" Thomas rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. "Was going to be a bunkhouse at first, for the hands. Then I thought maybe a guest house. But lately," he turned to her, "I've been thinking about starting over." Clara stared at him, unsure what he meant. "I don't want to live alone anymore," he said simply. "I've had years of silence. I've buried the past. It's time I looked forward. And when I do, I see you there." Her heart stopped. Thomas took a slow breath, the way a man does when saying something he's never said before. "I'm not offering flowers or courtship. I'm not pretending this is a fairy tale. I know you've been hurt, and I know the town hasn't been kind to you, but I've watched you, Clara. I see how hard you work, how you carry yourself, how you never ask for pity. I respect you." Clara opened her mouth, but no words came. "I don't want a wife out of duty or convenience," Thomas added. "I want someone I can trust. Someone who knows what it means to survive. Someone who wants to build something steady, honest, lasting." His voice grew quieter. "I know I'm not a man full of sweet talk, but I can give you a home, a real one, and a future where no one owns your name but you." Tears stung Clara's eyes, not from sadness, but from the quiet power of his offer. "You don't care about my past?" she whispered. "I care about who you are now. That's all that matters to me." She took a shaky breath. No one had ever looked at her like that before. No one had ever offered her something so simple, so human: respect, stability, a place to belong. It wasn't a proposal dressed in lace or poetry. but it was the most honest thing anyone had ever. Given her dot, Clara looked up at the unfinished house, imagining herself on the porch, her hands no longer hiding, her head held high. She could see it her future, not handed to her, but built beside someone who saw her strength, not her shame. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice steady but soft. Thomas nodded. "Take all the time you need." She smiled faintly. "That's more than most have given me." As they stood in the field, the wind rustled through the tall grass, and for the first time in a long while, Clara felt something she hadn't dared feel since arriving in Dust River. Hope. Clara. May didn't say yes immediately, but she didn't say no either. After Thomas's quiet, earnest proposal, she returned to her work at the bakery with her mind running in circles. The idea of marrying again, not for survival, not to escape her past, but to build something real, both terrified and intrigued her. This wasn't like the mail-order arrangement she'd hoped for when she first stepped off that stagecoach. This was something more complicated, more meaningful. Thomas McAllister had not promised her love, but he had promised respect. And in her world, that had become a far rarer treasure. Over the following weeks, they began spending more time together, not as fiancés but as partners in consideration. Clara helped him pick out curtains for the half-built house. She chose fabric for the chairs, jars for the pantry, even a simple but elegant china set he insisted on buying for company someday. With each small decision, Clara found herself smiling more, laughing quietly at his dry humor and letting her guard down inch by inch. Thomas wasn't like other men. He didn't fill silences with idle chatter or meaningless flattery. He spoke when it mattered. He listened even more. And he saw her not as Clara May, the saloon girl, not as the rejected bride, but as the woman standing in front of him, capable and courageous, forging a new life from scratch. One chilly morning, Clara brought over a basket of cinnamon rolls. She'd baked before sunrise. Thomas met her on the porch, eyes tired but warm. "You should be in town sleeping," he said, taking the basket. "I couldn't sleep," she replied. "And I owed you a thank you. For what? For giving me time and space, and not asking me to be someone I'm not." He nodded, but something unreadable flickered across his face. "I never wanted anyone but you, just as you are." It was the first time he said anything that hinted at something deeper than partnership. Clara's heart fluttered, but she didn't speak. She wasn't ready to label what was growing between them. She just knew it was real. Their days began to form a rhythm. Clara still worked at the bakery but spent more evenings at the ranch. She helped Thomas care for the horses, and he taught her how to ride more confidently across his fields. He admired her steady hand and sharp eye. She admired his patience, the way he treated every living thing with quiet respect, even when eyed his picked, even when fezvenlus. He thought no one was watching. One evening, as they sat under the stars with cups of coffee between them, Thomas finally asked the question that had hung between them for weeks. "Do you think we could ever make a real marriage of it?" Clara looked at him. The firelight cast shadows across his face, softening the rugged lines worn by grief and hard work. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've never had a real marriage before. Never even had someone stay." "I've had someone stay," he replied, voice low, "and then lost her. But I'm not looking to replace her, Clara. I'm looking to start again. With you. If that's something you'd want too." Clara felt a lump rise in her throat. She reached out, placed her hand over his. "I don't know what love's supposed to look like," she whispered. "But I think maybe we're finding it, slow and steady, like the rest of the good things in life." Thomas turned his hand and gently held hers. It was the first time they touched like that, and it meant more than a dozen kisses ever could. It wasn't passion that bloomed between them. It was trust, respect, a bond forged not by need, but by choice. And in that moment, Clara knew this wasn't about escaping her past anymore. This was about choosing her future. A few days later, she returned to the half-built house with a small bundle of her belongings. Not everything, just a start. A book she loved, a blue dress she'd sewn herself, a photograph of her mother. She set them down inside the front room and turned to Thomas, who stood quietly behind her. "I'm not just saying yes," she told him. "I'm saying let's build something worth holding on to." His answer was a nod, a smile, and the quietest, most heartfelt embrace she'd ever known. The town might still whisper. Her past might still linger. But here, in the space they were, shaping together, love was growing not loud or fast, but deep, steady, and sure. Clara May had begun to breathe easier. The house was nearly finished. A simple cottage, nestled in a grove of cottonwoods on the edge of Thomas McAllister's ranch. It wasn't grand, but it was hers, in a way no place had ever been before. She and Thomas had settled into a rhythm that felt right. The days were filled with labor and shared meals, and the nights with conversation by the fire and moments of quiet companionship. There were no grand declarations of love, but the bond between them had grown undeniably strong, woven from patience, honesty, and respect. Clara still worked at the bakery, but whispers in town had softened. People had grown used to seeing her. Some even greeted her with a nod. It wasn't full acceptance, but it was a start. Until her past came stomping back into town. It began with a stagecoach one Thursday afternoon. A new arrival stepped off James Harland, her former would-be groom. His presence alone was enough to stir gossip again. But it wasn't long before the real trouble began. Clara was loading sacks of flour at the back of the bakery when she heard his voice, loud, familiar, and bitter. "Well, well, there's the runaway bride." She froze. Turning slowly, she faced James, who stood smirking with a crooked smile and a heart full of spite. "Didn't take long to trade me in for a richer rancher, huh?" "I didn't trade anyone," Clara said calmly. "You rejected me the minute you learned who I used to be. And now you've got McAllister building you a house like you're a lady?" James laughed, loud enough for passers-by to hear. "Ain't that rich?" "You fooled me, Clara, but the town should know better." Clara's stomach tightened. A small crowd had begun to gather. The whispers returned like an old wound opening again. "She's nothing but a saloon girl in a new dress," James declared. "Think you're respectable now?" "We both know what you are." Clara didn't flinch this time. She looked James dead in the eyes. "No, you know who I was. But I know who I am. And I won't let a coward like you define that for me." He stepped closer, voice low and venomous. "He'll regret marrying you, Clara. Just wait." Before she could respond, a second voice cut through the air. "She didn't fool me, Harland. I knew everything, and I still chose her." The crowd turned as Thomas McAllister stepped forward, calm and composed. He stood between Clara and James with a strength that quieted the street. "You call her a saloon girl like it's a crime," Thomas said. "But what I see is a woman who rebuilt her life from nothing, who works harder than most men I know, who carries herself with more grace than anyone in this town has ever given her credit for." James scoffed, but Thomas didn't stop. "I lost a good woman once because I spent too much time worrying about what other people thought. I won't make that mistake again." He turned slightly, addressing the crowd now. "You all judge Clara for her past. But how many of you could survive what she's been through and still stand with your head held high?" There was silence, uneasy shifting. No one met Clara's eyes. Then a voice rang out, "Mrs. Whitlow. I'd take Clara May over any so-called decent woman who's never lifted a hand to help another soul." Next came old Mr. Green from the stable. "She helped save my colt last spring. Without her, I'd have lost half a season's work." A few others nodded. A quiet ripple of agreement spread. The wind shifted. Something was changing. James stood stiffly, realizing he was losing his audience. He muttered under his breath and stormed off, his pride bruised and ego shattered. Clara stood there, stunned not just by Thomas's defense, but by the town's reaction. For so long, she had been surviving in silence. But today, she had been seen, truly seen. Later, as she and Thomas walked back to the ranch, she said softly, "You didn't have to defend me like that." Thomas took her hand. "Yes, I did. Because no one else did when they should have. And because I love you." Clara stopped walking. He had never said those words before. She looked up at him, eyes glassy with emotion. "I love you too." They stood together in the fading light, no longer hiding, no longer running. For the first time, Clara's past had been confronted, and it hadn't broken her. It had freed her. The days that followed, Thomas's public defense of Clara May marked a turning point, not just for her, but for the entire town of Dust River. Whispers still floated on the wind, but they no longer carried the same venom. Something in the townsfolk had shifted. Perhaps it was the firm conviction in Thomas's voice, or the quiet respect Clara had earned through months of hard, honest labor. Maybe it was the realization that everyone had a past, but few had the courage to own it as Clara had. Regardless of the reason, things began to change. Mrs. Whitlow proudly introduced Clara as my baker and my best girl to anyone who stepped into her shop. The preacher's wife invited her to a church picnic carefully, but sincerely. Even the tailor who once turned her away gave her a nod on the street and offered to hem her dress for free as a wedding gift. Yes, wedding gift. Clara and Thomas had decided not to wait. After all the battles they had fought alone, together, and against the town's judgment, they saw no reason to delay building their life side by side. The wedding was held under the cottonwoods behind the cottage. They had finished together, simple and heartfelt, surrounded by a small crowd who had once doubted her, and now quietly admired her. Clara wore a sky blue dress, the same one she had brought in her small bundle the day she said yes. She had stitched it herself during her years in St. Louis, never knowing it would one day be her wedding gown. Thomas stood beside her in a dark vest and crisp white shirt, freshly pressed, his hands a little rough but his heart as steady as ever. When they exchanged vows, Clara's voice did not waver. "I do not promise you perfection," she said, her eyes locked on Thomas's, "but I promise you honesty, loyalty, and love, not the kind you read in stories, but the kind you live every day, one choice at a time." Thomas's response was equally grounded and moving. "I can't give you a clean slate, Clara," he said, "but I can give you a clean heart, one that sees you clearly, one that will stand beside you no matter what the world says." The kiss that followed wasn't theatrical. It was soft, slow, and full of quiet triumph. Afterward, they served fresh bread, warm stew, and apple pie baked by Clara and Mrs. Whitlow. There was no orchestra, just a fiddle played by the town schoolteacher, and laughter echoing across the fields. And for the first time in years, Clara felt free. Not because her past had disappeared. It hadn't. Not because everyone in town had accepted her, some hadn't, but because she had accepted herself. And she had found someone who didn't just tolerate her scars but respected. The story they told. In the months that followed, the cottage became a home. Clara planted a vegetable garden behind the house and painted the window frames pale yellow. Thomas added a small reading nook where she could sit in the afternoon sun with her favorite books. They adopted a stray dog who followed Clara home from the bakery one morning and named him Huck. Clara still worked at the bakery 3 days a week, not because she needed to, but because it kept her connected to her roots. And she liked knowing people no longer looked through her, but at her with recognition, sometimes even warmth. Every so often, someone would ask about her story, how she went from saloon girl to rancher's wife. Clara never flinched. She didn't hide it. She told them the truth, plain and proud, because her story wasn't one of shame anymore. It was one of strength. And when people asked what made her stay in Dust River, even after everything, she would smile and say, "Because this is where I stopped running and started living." Sometimes, when the evening settled quiet over the prairie and the stars began to scatter across the sky, Clara and Thomas would sit on their porch, hands entwined, listening to the crickets and watching the horizon. Not every moment was easy. The land still needed tending, the town still held its judgments, and the world hadn't magically become gentle. But Clara had finally found what she had crossed, miles and heartbreak to seek, not just a home. Not just a husband, but a future one. She had chosen for herself,